So, you want to do some surveying. Well, guess what? That's a fantastic thing to do. The problem is surveying is actually a very difficult science. You could spend years and lifetimes studying how to study people. So what I've been asked to do is prepare a very short video with a few tips and tricks to help you in your research project prepare good, valid surveys. And what you'll realize is that writing a survey is actually almost as much an art as it is a science. Now, why would you survey anyway? What is the point of doing a survey? Well, the reason people spend time and energy and money on surveys is because as much as we might like to know what does every Australian think about Miley Cyrus, we can't. That's too complex an answer to get. We can't ask all 24 million people, what do you think of Miley Cyrus? It's too complex, there's too much money involved. What we can do is take a small group of people that represent the different demographic backgrounds of all of Australia and ask them, what do you think of Miley Cyrus? And if we do our job well, that small data sample will actually reflect the overall general Australian population. However, getting to that point is quite challenging and involves a lot of thinking through of your surveying process. But a good survey always starts with a really good question. You might have noticed that your RP teachers are really focusing on you and trying to help you come up with the best possible question, because a vague question is very hard to research, and a vague question is almost impossible to survey for. So a good survey that leads to good data that will give you a good analysis at the end starts with a really solid, well-focused question. The more time you spend knowing what you want to research and what specific answers you are looking for, the better your surveying experience and your survey data will be. That usually starts with a narrow topic. You don't want to survey a huge, wide-ranging topic because the data analysis will be overwhelming. Your surveys will be too long. So you want to start with a nice, narrow topic. But in narrowing down your topic, you have to be careful of bias. Bias is something that we all have. Every human being is biased about everything. We like to tell ourselves we're not, but we are. And so one of your jobs as a statistician is to be able to remove as much of your bias from this process as possible. So even in how you narrow down your question, be careful that you aren't biasing yourself too much towards your own personal preferences. If your general question is something along the lines of, shouldn't we change our current uniform policy because it's silly? Well, you've actually already interjected your own bias into that question. You need to be careful not to do that. But bias comes in a lot of different ways. Not just in the question you ask, but how you ask those questions. It also comes into the ways and the kinds of people that you ask questions of. Bias crops up everywhere in surveys, and you need to be careful. If you want good, robust data, you have to eliminate as much bias as possible. For example, do you like peanut butter? That's a great question. However, if you only ask that question to people who are allergic to peanuts, you've introduced sampling bias into your data. They're going to say no, but that sample population will not represent the overall population that you are looking for. So say you've got a good question that's free of bias. Okay, what do you do now? You have to ask yourself, what kind of data do I need to collect? And generally speaking, there are two forms that data comes in: quantitative and qualitative. Quantitative data is generally numerical data. Data that's black and white, hard, cold numbers. 75% of students feel. 84% of married women believe. Numbers are easy to work with. And they make things very simple when it comes to analysis. The problem with quantitative data is that it often leaves out certain elements of humanity. None of us can be reduced down to numbers. Humanity is too complex for that. So quantitative data, though it's really easy to work with, does have some limitations. The other form is qualitative data. This is open answers. So in your survey you may ask, how do you feel about, and give people a text box to respond in. And that's great. You're getting personal data, you're getting people to input their own ideas into it. That's fantastic. But that's also really hard to work with. One of the dangers of qualitative data is that in your analysis you have to somehow condense all these words that people have written into one nice, succinct sort of summary, and in doing that, it's very easy to introduce your own bias into it. You're interpreting someone else's answer, and that's not their own actual response. So the value and the ease of quantitative data is that numbers are easy to work with. The value of qualitative data is it gives you more comprehensive responses. Both have weaknesses, and depending on that initial question will determine how much quantitative data versus qualitative data you put into your research project. A good research paper will include elements of both. Okay, so you've worked out what kind of data you want. Now you have to decide what sort of questions are you going to ask. And that's going to again depend on qualitative versus quantitative. A good example of, say, quantitative data would be to say, do you agree or disagree with the following? On average, do you? How many times in a week have you? Quantitative data is responses that you have given the audience to answer. Qualitative data is again open responses. And you need to judge which question and which data is more appropriate for your subject. One of the things to be careful of is that if you ask your survey respondents lots of qualitative data, you're asking them to write a lot and people get tired. At the same time, if you've got a bunch of buttons and quantitative data you want from your audience, after 20 or 30 questions, they're going to get bored and tired and stop answering. So you've got to be careful not to ask just what kind of questions, how many questions are you asking? It might be nice to ask 120 questions, but who's going to fill out a 120 question survey? I'm not, you aren't, don't do it. Writing questions is also one of the trickiest parts of preparing a good survey because your questions need to be understandable to a range of different people with different backgrounds, different levels of education, and different understandings. So as you word these questions, you need to be very careful that they're very, very clear and very concise and there's no room for misunderstanding. Take, for example, the question, do you think peanut butter tastes good? That's actually a very different question to, do you like peanut butter? One is about taste, one is about overall perception. Some people may actually love peanut butter, but they don't eat it because of the health issues involved. Some people may be allergic to peanut butter but still think it tastes great. So the very questions you ask need to be very carefully considered for all possible responses and recognize that it's easy to ask one question but get responses to a very different question that you never intended to ask because you didn't consider how your audience was going to respond. A good rule for writing questions in a survey is to make them as neutral as possible. Don't introduce any words into a question you don't have to. For example, if you said, do you agree that Bon Jovi sucks? Which, why would you? Because no one does. But if you were to ask that question, what you've actually done is introduced your own bias into the wording of your question. And so people's response might actually be more to the way you've worded the question than actually the question you're trying to figure out to begin with. Questions and responses need to take into consideration the variety of possible humanity that might be responding to your survey. Very few things in life are either yes or no, true or false. And you need to take that into consideration when you're writing questions. That's why it's always a good idea to include a neutral or unsure option in your possible responses. That gives people who either sit on the fence or haven't given much time and consideration to your topic a way to answer without locking in yes or no, which may not actually be appropriate. For example, you could ask the question, do you like wearing socks? Some people will say yes, but that yes will depend on the circumstances. Do you like wearing socks at the beach? Well, that's a whole other topic. Do you like wearing socks in bed? Some people will never do that, but they'll wear them during the day. Some people will never wear socks unless they're going to the toilet. So that simple question, do you like wearing socks, needs to be considered from multiple different angles and multiple different possible responses. Also, when you start framing your questions, beware of loaded words. Words that have a specific meaning to you, but may not mean things to other people. Take, for example, the question, do you think Hitler was evil? That's a simple enough question, except when you start debating what does it mean to be evil. And that's actually a topic for a philosophy class. Evil is going to mean different things to different people. Do you mean, was the person Hitler evil, or were his actions evil? And what about the nice things about Hitler? He was a great lover of animals. He took very good care of his servants. So what do you mean evil? He did some good things, a lot of bad things. Were they evil things? That's a very subjective word. And just because you know what you mean by evil doesn't mean your audience will know what you mean by evil. If in your surveying you need to use a very emotional word or a word related to morality, it's really important to define that for your audience so they can respond to your definition and not just assume that they're going to understand what you mean by some of these very challenging words. It's very important when doing surveys to also avoid absolutist language. Questions that include the words always, every time, in all situations, that don't give the person room to sort of wiggle out, limit their responses. For example, if I were to ask the question, do you always feel valued at school? You might think to yourself, well, I feel valued 95% of the time, but that's not always, is it? There's that one time I come to school and my teacher gives me a hard time, and I don't feel very valued. So the question, do I always feel valued? Well, I have to answer no, even though I feel valued 95% of the time. Absolutist language is a really good way to get yourself in trouble in a survey setting. So always give people a range of responses. A good question to ask might be then, respond to the statement, I feel valued at school. And then you give a range of responses like strongly agree, neutral or unsure, disagree, strongly disagree. That way you've taken the same question, but given people a range of responses and then a range of weighting to their responses. Some will strongly agree, while some will agree, some will strongly disagree, and some will just disagree, and some will be on the fence. And you need to take that into consideration when you're preparing your survey. It's also important, once you've got a good question and a good survey, to ask, who are you going to survey? Because the goal of a survey is to make assumptions about a larger population which you can't actually ask. And so you need to consider that your smaller population is actually reflective of the larger population that you are actually trying to study. It's one thing to ask your friends, to do a survey for you, but your friends are probably a lot like you. And so then your answers, your survey results, are going to be weighted to people like you. You need to get as diverse a possible sampling cohort as possible so that your data will scale up to the larger general population as best as possible. If you ask people, are you a cat person or a dog person, but you haven't been careful and it turns out most of the people in your survey are actually allergic to cats, well, you've actually introduced that sample bias back into your survey. Now, this is particularly interesting when you're in a school setting. You could be studying people's responses and attitudes towards cows, and if you ask people at a rural private school, they may give a very different response to that than people in an urban public school. So you need to ask, what is your general question? If your general question is overall attitudes towards cows, well, then you take into consideration that one school is not appropriate enough to survey because your general population will be very different from your sample population. And finally, you also need to ask yourself, what sort of presentation of the data, what sort of analysis do I need to be doing? And in fact, that's what should determine your very initial design of your survey. You need to know, how are you going to present this data? What sort of analysis do you be able to do so you can make sure to ask the right questions? Are you looking to present qualitative data? Well, how are you going to do that? Is that going to be in a summary sheet, in a table? How are you going to do that? What about your quantitative data? Is that going to be in a graph? What kind of graph? Different data needs to be presented differently depending on the kinds of questions you want to ask. Is it going to be a percentages? Is it going to be a total number of respondents? You also want to know what kind of analysis you're going to want to do with your data. If you're asking the question, do you enjoy Australian rules football? You're probably going to want to ask in your survey, are you male or female? That way you can go back there and start dividing your data. Well, actually men have a statistically different response than women do. Or what about age? If you ask about their interest in politics or something political, age will probably be an influencing factor in that decision. So you need to know, of your sample respondents, what is the age breakdown? So you can then divide your data up amongst different age brackets to determine their level of interest in politics. It's complex, I know. Doing surveys and analysis is not easy. That's why you can go and get a PhD in it. But for what you are doing, the more you can nail down a good question with good survey questions to get good data that's presented well, the better your research project is going to be. One of the best ways to do this is to do a pilot study. A pilot study is where you do all of your work, prepare your survey, and then give it to a small number of people, 10, 15, 20, whatever. Get their answers back, do all of your number crunching on that small data set and say, did this get me to where I wanted to go? Did I actually get to the level of data and analysis that I need? If not, you can go back, retool your survey before you send it out to your wider full survey response. A pilot study is a fantastic way to make sure that you're going to get the kind of data you need to answer that initial question that you're researching. It's complex, it can be a lot of fun, and you can learn a lot. Happy surveying.